Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Chairman Powell. Good to see you. I want to follow up on some questions that my colleague, Senator Brown Shelby, asked you about. Inflation is continuing to run below the Fed's 2% target, which has prompted a majority of regional Federal Reserve Bank presidents to urge a study of the current inflation framework. And while we have seen significant economic gains since the worst days of the recession, most hardworking families are still waiting to see their paychecks rise. Real median wages increased by only 14% from 1979 to 2017, and any recent acceleration in wages is accruing to high-paid executives and managers, with production and non-supervisory workers simply not seeing those gains. The Fed's projecting a minimum of 3 interest rate increases in 2018, and after your testimony on Tuesday, the markets are now anticipating as many as 4 hikes. Do you agree that the achievement of full employment should be associated with strong and broad-based wage growth for average workers, not just increases for executives and managerial pay?
I do, Senator.
And if so, doesn't that argue for consideration of a monetary policy path that would allow wages to continue to grow prior to the Fed's pumping the brakes?
I agree that it does, and I believe that is in fact the path we're on. These are gradual rate increases, and we do expect wages to move up.
What would the cost to the economy of overshooting inflation in the 2 to 3% range versus the cost to the economy of choking off growth if the Fed continues to tighten without a clear indication that inflation is going to exceed its target be?
Well, the risk, one of the risks we're trying to avoid, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the risks are more balanced than they used to be. For many years, it was clear there was a lot of slack in the economy, and I, for one, supported accommodative policy. At this point, we have 4.1% unemployment, and the thing we don't want to avoid we don't want to have happen is to get behind the curve, have inflation move up, and have to raise rates too quickly, cause a recession. And recessions, they hit the most vulnerable groups, the hardest. And so that's where unemployment goes up the fastest and that kind of thing. So to prolong the recovery, the committee's view is that we should continue on this gradual path of rate increases, which balances lower inflation and low wages against the need to make sure that we don't run too far past the natural rate of unemployment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope you'll continue to look at wage growth as part of your calibrations. Let me ask you this. During the confirmation hearing, I was pleased to vote for you. I asked you about the economic risks of adding an additional $1.5 trillion to the deficit. And I just heard your responses to my colleague from Tennessee that we're not on a sustainable path. We need to get one. Obviously, we weren't on a sustainable path before we added $1.5 trillion to the debt in the tax cuts that were generated. And you then said in response, and I quote, "I think we need to be concerned with fiscal sustainability over the long term." And in the same hearing, you agreed with Senator Van Hollen when he asked you said adding $1.5 trillion to the deficit would make a bad situation worse. Now, your predecessor previously testified before this committee when she said, quote, "I'm personally concerned about the U.S. debt situation. Taking what is already a significant problem and making it worse is a concern to me." Do you agree with former Chairman Yellen that there's reason to be concerned about mounting deficits and growing national debt?
I do, and I'll follow what my predecessors have done and not get too much into the details of fiscal policy, but I will say a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, we need to get on a sustainable fiscal path in the longer run. We know that we're not in the longer run. The second thing is when we do fiscal policy, when you do fiscal policy, I think it's important to keep in mind measures that would increase the productive capacity of the United States, of the economy, things that would increase productivity, that foster investment in people, in education and training, in R&D, and in plant and equipment as well. Those kinds of policies can help the whole economy grow faster on a sustainable basis.
I agree with you. It's just that stock buybacks don't quite do that. Let me ask you a last question. In January, the New York Federal Reserve Bank president said that tax legislation is likely to generate frictional costs that will mitigate its effects on growth, namely disparate impacts regionally. In particular, President Dudley was pointing out the gutting of the state and local income and property tax deduction, which would raise the cost of ownership and adversely affect prices and construction activity in states like New Jersey. Do you agree with President Dudley's analysis that states like New Jersey will see regional economic disparities as a result of the tax bill?
Senator, I hope you'll allow me to say that I'd rather not get into the particular details of any particular fiscal bill as chairman, and I think I'm happy to talk about things at a high level, but getting into commenting on particular sections in a fiscal bill, which is not our responsibility for me, is probably not a good idea.
Your president of the New York Reserve made that observation, so I would hope that we would look at the consequences to regional growth as part of your overall growth path. The region that I'm from generates nearly 20 to 25% of GDP for the entire nation. If we're going to have policies that ultimately affect the ability to be that engine for part of economic growth of the country, we should be considering that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cotton.